think they're on. Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, trips, and classes. So please check our website for a full list. So a bit of housekeeping before we start. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar over here before asking your questions so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation, but also ensure that the question is going to be recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them right out front behind the cash registers. And we will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up by the pillar over here. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. Now for the main event, I am honored to introduce Elizabeth Cobbs to all of you. Elizabeth earned her PhD in American history at Stanford. She now holds the Melbourne Glasscock Chair at Texas A&M University. Her books have won 4 literary prizes, 2 for American history and 2 for fiction. And she has won prizes as well for documentary filmmaking. She has been a Fulbright Scholar in Ireland and a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And she has served on the Historical Advisory Committee of the U.S. State Department and the jury for the Pulitzer Prize in History. This evening, she will talk about her new book, Fearless Women, Feminist Patriots from Abigail Adams to Beyoncé. In this new work of nonfiction, Elizabeth explores the lives of many women from American history who dared defy society and fight for what they believe in. From the right to own property, to the right to vote, to the right to earn a living, the women on Elizabeth's new book devoted their lives to the cause that they fought for. Kirkus Reviews calls the book a fresh, well-researched perspective on women's history. Elizabeth will be in conversation with Liza Mundy. Liza is the author of 4 books, including the New York Times bestseller Code Girls, the untold story of the American women codebreakers of World War II. She has appeared on The Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, MSNBC, CNN, and NPR. So everyone, let us all welcome Elizabeth Cobbs and Liza Mundy.
Thank you so much, and thank you, as always, to Politics and Prose for creating this space for us and for having us here, and thank you all for coming to share the evening with us. It's thrilling for me to be on a panel again with Elizabeth Cobbs. We had the great pleasure, and I had the privilege of being on a panel with her 5 years ago in Tucson, when we both had books out at about the same time at the Tucson Book Festival. And our panel was called Women in War because Elizabeth had written a wonderful book called The Hello Girls about women telephone operators during World War I who were among the first American women to be in combat settings when they went to France during World War I and kept the troops in touch with each other, and that was wonderful. And I had written a book about women codebreakers during World War II, and also on the panel was Kate Moore, who had written a wonderful book called Radium Girls. And that was, I remember that Elizabeth went first of the 3 of us, and the minute she started talking, I was like, this is just gonna be great. So, so you're in for a treat to hear her speak about her wonderful work, and I'm such a fan of your book and really look forward to talking about it and to hearing you talk about it. So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit broadly about the book and its themes and thesis and what caused you to write it. And so I thought I would start with, I think anybody who's read anything about women's history in the United States has probably heard the phrase Abigail Adams' famous phrase to her husband, John Adams, remember the ladies, when you're writing, when you all down in Washington or Philadelphia are writing the founding documents. And so we know that phrase, but I think fewer of us know what he said in return, because it's not quite as pretty as we'd like to think. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that exchange, their relationship, and the theme of your book, which is that feminism is in fact part and parcel of the American story and was set in motion by the documents that were written at that time.
Yeah, it's, I think this is Women's History Month, and I think there's a tendency to think that if you are looking at women's history, that it's sort of like, here's the main dish, and here's something that pairs well with it on the side. You offer, a little something that's kind of fun, rather than thinking of it as any kind of driver of history. And in the same way that a lot of historians and authors have said slavery was a driver of American history, this is an element of American history that's really been underplayed. We don't get how the Industrial Revolution is because of all of the women teachers, people whom Abigail Adams said, women should be able to go to high school. And then ladies' academies were started, women's high schools, and that really lays the basis for making a mass literate labor, working class. And so these are so many ways in which women are really the foundation of American history. And it's kind of weird, like if you wrote a history, you said, let's write American history. We're going to start by taking out half the people. And then we're going to talk about the other half. And you're like, well, weren't those other people doing something? And in fact, women were not only doing something, right, in the sort of basic sense that, reproducing the human race, but also feminists were behind so many of the most important achievements of American society. And so if we rob ourselves of that story, it's not like we're doing it because, wouldn't it be fun to dress it up? It's because otherwise we don't get, how do we get Social Security? Or, how do we get abolition in law? In law, not the Emancipation Proclamation, and things like that. So it was, it was very fun. I have to say, Liza and I were talking earlier, when did you start writing women's history? And I pretty much backed into it. I wasn't one of those people who said, I'm going to go write women's history. But then when you start to think about really what were the drivers in some ways of American history in general, these women played such a significant role. And in the case of the Hello Girls, which is not this book but the other one, these were women who fielded 26 million phone calls from the trenches between the commandants and the trenches, talking men through the night, getting orders conveyed, doing the things that made the war go. So there's just so many stories where you go, wow, why would we rob ourselves of that history?
Why would we treat it as a side part of history as opposed to an integral part of history? Okay, but the Adamses. So she says, remember the ladies, and he says, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, so it's so funny. And so, Liza, I think part of the interest of that story is you look at two people who are married, right? And one of them is saying to the other, honey, I'd like you to think about this. And he's like, so she's presuming upon the marital relationship, right? And she's presuming his goodwill. And she says, I'd like you to remember the ladies when you're writing the new laws so that future laws won't allow bad men, not men like you, she says, very diplomatically, not most men, but there are some men who will use the power they have as absolute tyrants with impunity, And, if we're not a part of making the laws, what right do you have to put laws over us? So John says, I cannot but laugh. That's what he writes back. I cannot but laugh. And then he goes on to say, well, it's also kind of not nice. It's a little disloyal. And this is kind of the first anti-feminist comment, I think, where somebody who you think should be sympathetic, but is also concerned about what are the down-the-road consequences. And so he blows her off totally. This is not subtle. But a month later, he writes to another Massachusetts legislator, and he says, because that guy is thinking about, how should we write the voting rights of Massachusetts? Should we let men of color vote? Should we let poorer classes vote? So he's writing all that. And John Adams says, be careful. Who knows where this is going to end up? And depend upon it, sir, women will ask for a vote. So he says that in 1776, before the Declaration of Independence, because he knows that the meaning, the heart, the soul of that document is that all men, women, whatever, are created equal. And so it's kind of this internal logic that really drives American history, and women are so much a part of that.
Right, but I guess sort of for me, the cognitive dissonance is that, the surprise for me was to know that, yeah, they really did actually talk about inclusion. Like, they considered being inclusive and thought, no. So it wasn't like they forgot. It wasn't like they were only looking at the men in the room and writing. They really gave it some thought and some discussion and thought, don't want to go down that road. That was
and that's that old
I
thing
was
of
taken by that.
Sure, and we often say, did people know slavery was wrong, or maybe they just didn't know back then.
Right,
But then
right,
you look at documents where people discuss these things
Right.
carefully. And in that case, I thought this was really fun, a very interesting fact I didn't know, which is that New Jersey, so there are 13 colonies, right, that become states, and each of them has to decide who do we let vote and who do we not, and who do we write color into or race into the Constitution, et cetera. New Jersey, of them all, just says, well, of course, everybody can vote if they're over a certain age and they own some property, some minimal property, which means that women and men of color who were property owners and were not enslaved could vote in New Jersey. And they did this for 30 years. And then they went, oh, no, don't like that law, not feeling it anymore. And at that point, they just, without anybody really raising a stink that we know, they disenfranchise women and also property men of color. So people knew. It's exactly what you said, Liza. People knew that this is where it could go, and they made a very conscious effort to limit the extent of change. Now, before we damn them utterly, we have to remember that they could barely get agreement on declaring independence. Mm-hmm. So, Abigail's writing John. They haven't declared independence yet, and she's kind of like knocking on the door. Why haven't you declared independence yet? And she also says, I don't think those southern states, which are always robbing enslaved people of their liberty, how can we count on them to fight as hard as we will here in Massachusetts? So both issues come up in that same letter.
And I guess on the flip side of that, the point that you make, if I understand it correctly, is that this fundamental idea behind our founding documents that all men would be tyrants if they could, the idea that we must resist a monarchy, any sort of authoritarian form of government, because even a good, absolute power corrupts absolutely, that even a potentially good person would become a tyrant. So that founding insight of the American Revolution and the creation of the country also then becomes the engine for what you lay out in this fascinating book, which is, and so the case has to be made. All right, we get written out, but then we have to win back, or win, period, all of the various rights that you go through in your book on that principle. Men would be tyrants if they could.
Right, and this is an era in which there's the early organizing against slavery in England, around the same time. So, could the American colonies have abolished slavery? Could they have enfranchised women? We don't know. But it's not like these things were as strange an idea as we might now, in retrospect, think. Oh, they just didn't think of that, because they did think about it, and they thought they couldn't get it. And so people like Abigail and John are, two human beings caught in that. And that notion of someone being a tyrant, that really goes back to John Locke. Okay, I won't get too down in the weeds here. I know that starts to put people to sleep. John Locke, wasn't that in first semester college? But he was the person who articulated the rationale for democracy, for representative government. And he had what are famously called 2 treatises of government. Never he talks about the second one, where he says, men should be able to choose their governors and change them as easily as they would their physicians. There's no reason why any man has, the right by his royal blood to rule over me. That was the second treatise. The first treatise is a treatise against patriarchy. And in fact, the document was called Patriarchy, and it was a preceding argument that preceded Locke's, where someone was saying, well, you see, there was Adam and Eve, and they blew it, Eve blew it, but what God gave to Adam was the right to rule his family, and kings were all, from the lineal descendants of Adam. Anyway, as I said, it gets down in the weeds, but what was interesting is that the first people to speak out against patriarchy were white men in the American Revolution. And they said, shouldn't be the case that one man rules us. Why is he any different from us? Isn't a man made by his education? And of course, that's why Abigail Adams, her real demand is for women's education. Yes, people are made by their education. And why aren't we allowed?
So talk about your principle of organization for your book, the decisions that you made in deciding how to lay it out and how to proceed and who to include.
So the book is organized by 8 chapters, and each chapter represents like a rung in a ladder, right? What rights do we get first, and how does that allow us to get a step up so that you can go for the next thing? And so in a way, that's an organizational principle of the book, you know, because I think we don't know. Like, when did women get to keep their wages if they earned them? Because you didn't for the first 150 years or something. So if you earned a wage, it belonged to your husband. So at what point did a woman get custody of her own children, which is fairly recent also? So I wanted to kind of scaffold that in those 8 chapters. But I also did this thing of, because I always feel like we have this idea that feminists are whiners, you know, that they're just kind of whiners, like, I broke my fingernail, oops, you know, whatever. And so we trivialize or tend to diminish these issues. And so in each chapter I have a woman who's, I think, is the face of feminism. She's the person who, like, has a plan, you know, like an Abigail Adams who thinks of something and, like, I need to try to get other people to think about this. I need to implement this thing that, you know, seems important to me. She's an organizer. But the second person is, I always call the why we care, you know? Why should we care? Like, was it really that bad? You know, weren't husband's pretty nice, and you got to stay home. My mom had 7 kids. My father would always say, well, you get to stay home. So I'm thinking 7 kids in 10 years, the you get to stay home part is really not a big advantage in terms of quality, although, you know. And so what happened in this, for example, in the chapter on Abigail Bailey, I have Abigail Adams, there's an Abigail Bailey. Yep. And she's a mother of 17. And her husband is a wonderful, I mean, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, you know, esteemed, a military officer, and also a predator. And so she lives in a world where it's similar to what today's conditions would be like in Afghanistan. There's women, when we start out, they don't have the right necessarily even to go out of their front door if their husbands don't give them permission. Now, by the way, most husbands do, as Abigail said, but some don't. And the law gives them the right not only to keep a wife at home, to chastise her as he see fits. I mean, it's in law. You know, you can beat your wife if she doesn't behave. Women don't have education. Women can't vote. So there's so many basic ways in which law just doesn't protect you. And you know, we all know law is imperfect, right? But think of all the so many ways in which law protects us. And so Abigail Bailey, you know, she's this crazy story where her husband, first of all, farms out the kids for pay because that's his right. She has no custody at all. And he also starts assaulting one of their daughters. Previous to that, he had like attacked some of the servants in the house, and when that got out and the town came down on him, he's like, okay, that's fine. So then he started preying on their daughter. And Abigail Bailey doesn't know what to do about it because here's the law. Okay, let's reel back here, folks. So in that period of time, if a person was let's say a woman was attacked or incest, and it was proven in a court of law, she could have to wear the letter I on her blouse for the rest of her life. So we all know about Hester Prynne, but the incest victim has to write I on her blouse for the rest of her life. And you could even be sentenced to prison and even be sentenced to death if you didn't report it soon enough, which of course we all know all 10-year-olds go out and do that, right? And so the other problem is that if she had divorced her husband, you know, he had complete custody. All husbands did. Wives did not own their children at all. And so these are the kind of laws that men as well as women would look at and go, you know, that's really, is that what we want? That's the kind of people we want to be? And so you start to see the breakdown of these laws and the lives of women who really suffered from the way the law was set up. By the way, she's a total heroine, grabs a horse, rides 200 miles in the snow, and I'm not making that up, and saves the kids. So you have to read the book, though.
Right, and the stories are very painful to read. The suffering. I mean, it's history now, and it's documents, and it's your book is wonderfully readable, but the suffering that you know the prominent privileged women, too, who are making the laws or leading the way, they suffered as well. And that, in many ways, I mean, that's one of the things that I really took away from the book is how much all of these women endured in their private lives because they were so close. I mean, a lot of it being family related, loss of children or, you know, lost a beloved husband, developing a mental illness, and that really comes through. I mean, your compassionate treatment and your illustrating of how important their private lives were and how acute their suffering was, and how, a woman like the second Abigail, I mean, it's just extraordinary that she was able to escape. And of course, there's Elizabeth Packard. Do you want to talk about Elizabeth?
Sure.
Packard?
So, and by the way, I want to say I try to avoid the utterly gruesome, because I think that the facts do speak for themselves, and so you don't have to, amp it up with adverbs and adjectives, et cetera, to the writers out there, because they're just these are simple people trying to live their lives in simple dignity, and the obstacles that the law presents, and men as well as women sympathize with them. Abigail Bailey, the sheriff waived his fees, the attorney waived his fees, and the judge waived his fees to get this guy convicted. But also all they could say to her is, well, we're really sorry, but by law, your husband has the right to your daughters. And by law, if you get divorced, he gets all the daughters, and you get nothing because he also owns everything. So if you divorce this man, you just end up, in New Hampshire in the snow or something. So I think that suffering is, to me, right. I mean, as historians or as journalists, our job is to be witnesses and not overplay it, but to just help us all witness in a loving way what we care about, which is kind of other people, and help us see how they made it. You mentioned a woman who had a husband who was mentally ill. That was Frances Perkins. Who's like, goddess Frances Perkins. She was the first member of a presidential cabinet in the United States. So the first woman in high office, high in government. And she really did not want to take this job. She was like 52 at the time, but she was well known as a labor person. She had defended the rights of laboring working people. She'd been a suffragist, and then she became one of the first women in government. But her husband was a mental patient and very seriously ill. And she just knew what it was like to be in Washington. She knew everybody be trolling through her trash. And so she really didn't want that. And she gave to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she gave him a list of like 10 names. Like, all these guys would be great. And he's like, I don't want to hear about it, Francis. I want you. And so she came to him and said, okay, I really don't want this job. I can think of all kinds of reasons why I should not be the one. But if I'm going to do the job, you got to let me do 3 things. You got to let me fight for a minimum wage. You've got to let me fight for Social Security, and you've got to let me fight for the third thing, which I'm forgetting at the moment, Social Security, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance. So if any of you has ever collected Social Security or unemployment insurance or earned a minimum wage, I'm trying to think, I might have done all 3 by now, we can all thank Frances Perkins. But she did it at a great personal cost, and for those of you who've been in government, you know how hard that can be. In fact, one of her feminist friends, former suffragist, and she was saying, I just don't want to do this, Molly Dewson. And Molly said, Frances, just don't be a baby about it. Another woman might not get asked for, 40 years, and we have to take our chance now, and I'll just murder you if you don't. So, somebody's pushing her into it because it's an act of service. And that is one of the themes of the book, is that feminism was really a series of acts of service to the nation. It still is.
That's a wonderful way to look at it. And the other thing that struck me as a longtime Washingtonian was how many of the figures in this book are based in Washington. Frances Perkins, I mean, how much of the feminist movement or achievements was happening in Washington. We think of the abolitionists and much of the suffragists as well, I think, coming from, say, the Boston area. But I guess just reading it from the point of view of a Washingtonian, I was struck by how many figures in the book. And if you could talk about Mary Church Terrell also, because she and her husband are really wonderful characters in the book.
Yeah, so Mary Church, I think they pronounce it Terrell, although there's always a debate on that. But her husband, Robert Terrell, was the first black judge in the District of Columbia, local judge, and which was kind of interesting because she was always kind of getting him in hot water because she was a feminist, and like people are like, well, you your wife over here is going to make it really hard for us to support you. In fact, Booker T. Washington and others were like, kind of keep the lid down on, her nickname was Molly, keep the lid on Molly. But she was just this fierce and beautiful and educated woman whose parents had made a fortune after Reconstruction in the South, and formerly enslaved, but then, became big, became very prominent. And so she was this person who was highly well educated. They sent her north when she was a kid. They didn't want her to be educated in Memphis, Tennessee, which you can understand at the time. So they sent her to Ohio, which had been a center of abolitionism. She went to Oberlin College. And then she went to Germany and got a master's degree there. And so she's this highly educated woman. And as she's leaving Germany, and by the way, 3 men in Germany asked for her hand. Mm-hmm. One was a baron. So I guess might have been a pretty good deal. And she's thinking, should I just stay over here? She thought it was interesting because she could see people in Germany were very anti-Semitic. And like, she couldn't get it. Like, why? What's that about? Why would you judge somebody on the basis of their religion? But when she told them about racism in the United States, they were like, well, why? I don't get that. Surely the color of their skin isn't the thing. And she's like, no, it is. And so she had to decide, do I just stay here? And so she's walking down the street one day in Berlin, and she walks, not thinking much about it, she walks past the American embassy in Berlin, and she sees that flag snapping in the breeze, the red, white, and blue. And she just says, that's my flag. I'm not going to let it be walked on by these people. I'm going to go back. And she even says, I guess I'm patriotic. It's kind of a revelation to her. And so it's really a lovely thing.
And talk about her achievements.
Well, so Mary Church Terrell, oh my gosh, she's one of those people who, just keeps going and going. She met, notably, with every president in the United States, other than Woodrow Wilson, which we could go into that, but we won't go into that. And by the way, that's such an interesting story unto itself, but she was a person who was steadily advocating for women's rights and for racial uplift would be in the terms of her time. Lifting as we climb was the motto of her organization. She was the first person to organize a nationwide coalition in support of black civil rights, basically. I mean, there had been, most of the, national groups were religious groups, the church groups. So the idea of a group that's just focused on let's work together to make the world a better place. And so she was president of that for a number of years, then made president for life, and she was a suffragist. She picketed at the White House. So she's down there with Alice Paul, the Alice Paul folks who are the, more famous in a sense than she is. She gets a call and they say, can you come on down? So she always brings her daughter, and they have to stand on bricks because it's hot, it's very, very cold. And so even in the winter, they stand on heated bricks to, berate people as they're coming out of the White House about women's suffrage. So, and then she persisted and was doing things all the way through the 1950s when she picketed segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C. So a lifetime of just dedicated service, to everybody, to all of us.
She and her husband, I think, are my favorite married couple in the book, and there are other great ones, but they. The way they supported each other, even when she created problems for her husband, he was always so supportive of her.
I have another friend who said that too. Just like, I just love that. His name was Berto. Hers was Molly, so that's her nicknames. I just love that Berto because he would, he just loved it when some guy would get up and say, well, certainly women should not have the vote because of this and that and this and that. And he said, oh, I would just like to sit back at those moments because there would be nothing left of him but a grease spot when Molly was done. So he was so proud of her and so sweet about it. So it was a pleasure to know them, as it were.
Yeah, and that, as you point out, though, she was not able to cast a vote because she lived in D.C. So
right, for Washingtonians, there's that problem, which is a different problem. You can't, cast a vote.
The other thing that struck me about her story compared to some of the other stories in the book, and I'm thinking specifically of you talk about the immigrant experience and your character who's an immigrant from Italy, how when Mary Church Terrell goes to Europe and she discovers a world, as did other people like James Baldwin, where you can move freely and not have to confront racism to that extent. So she found in some ways a more inclusive and accepting society in Europe. But for the immigrant Italian woman who comes from the working class, from the poor classes, to the United States, she finds much more opportunity and much more of a sense of equality.
Yeah, so that there is that interesting juxtaposition that what one person finds is sometimes very different from another. And my editor was like, how does this immigrant woman go with Mary Church Terrell? Because their lives in some ways were really different. But really it is that thing of, for Rosa Cavallari, she found that, becoming an American was a big deal, but becoming an American woman in some ways was an even bigger deal. Because in Italy, the men got in first in line at everything, and the women laid last in line at everything, and the woman was just there to basically be beaten, and she knew that. She accepted it. She understood that women were there to be beaten. I always remember this kind of sad story where she, when she was 11 or so, she was working for some nuns in some thread factory in Italy, and one of them said, "You're getting breasts. That's not very nice." And so she. Well, I'm sorry, but she, gets her a nice gray long dress, and then her mother, actually it was an adopted mother, she marries her off to a man, says, "I want to keep you safe for Christ, so we're going to give you to a man who will know how to rule you." So for her, coming to this country gave her such this vision, like, for example, if Rosa Cavallari were here right now, she could walk up to that question stand over there and ask a question. In Italy, she couldn't. And so when she went back once for a short trip, she said, "I just like to ask people questions to prove that I could still ask questions." And she had this whole thing about a hat. Like in America, you could get a hat. So when she went back to Italy, she had her hat. And she felt very proud. So these small symbolic ways that in someone's actual life meant a whole lot. And so there's that real disjuncture between what Mary Church Terrell saw in Europe and what the Europeans saw in America.
Right. And I think the immigrant experience, it I think feeds into your central thesis, which is those freedoms that were denied at the beginning to women and to so many other citizens. The promise was there, and so when she comes from Italy to the United States, she sees that, and she's able to embody it and experience it, the potential freedom, and realize it to a certain extent in her life, certainly improve her situation.
Yeah, she couldn't quite believe, seriously, like that you could ask a question, or if a man was dressed well, he must be the president. She couldn't understand that you could just come here and succeed and dress well. So those were just, very basic kinds of things that were, quite interesting to see how that changed people's lives and how then they took those promises.
Right.
Because in some ways, that's always the central dynamic in American history. This, you make this promise, all men are created equal. And so the kind of weird thing is that on almost all of these things, like should women be able to learn, there were lots of people said, "Oh, no, never that." And then women learn, and you're like, well, I guess it wasn't so bad. Yes, they can learn. How about if women speak in public, like we're doing? "Oh, no, not that." And they're like, so women start speaking in public, to great opposition, but they do. And then people are like, well, yeah, I suppose that's okay. And then, should women be able to keep their wages that they earn, or should they? And so there was always this dynamic where early on, and this was, I remember one woman talking about property rights. Should women, if they're married, by the way, that was the big distinction, being married and unmarried. So one of my characters in the early 20th century, she's just dead set against marriage, because she knows that if she gets married, she loses all kinds of things. You do, not just custom, but in law. She would lose her job, for example. A married woman couldn't work. And so these are people, each time you get a new right, people sort of accept it because they go, "Oh, well, yeah, that is the American creed. Okay, fine." So it's this interesting dynamic between people saying, well, that's too much, and then in retrospect saying, well, of course, that's fine. And that's where feminists kind of get caught in the crosshairs, because you don't really want to remember the people who brought that issue up. Like, they're just obnoxious. Like, oh, there's such a funny story. So when Susan B. Anthony they got the vote through, she wasn't alive by then, there was a big statue that was carved for the rotunda of the Capitol, because there were no women in the rotunda other than Pocahontas in a form-fitting white gown, which she probably wasn't wearing when people got over on this side of the water. So they carved it, and it was this beautiful statue, and, Congress assembled, and roses were laid at the foot of the statue. And the very next day, somebody pulled it out of the rotunda, took it down to the basement, scraped off the inscription saying the names of these women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, And it sat there until I think it was like 1997. Because, you don't really want to remember those people. And we have this weird need to put down these women that we don't have with our other founders.
Mm-hmm. That's a really depressing insight, but yeah, no, it's a striking insight. And also, you mentioned, so we gradually win these rights, and you talk about public speaking. And one of the many things I love about your book is you talk about anti-feminists who benefit from these rights, like the right to speak in public, in order to proclaim the anti-feminist message. And we see that all the way up, obviously, to the present day. And it is just sort of help us know how to think about that, and maybe talk about why you included some of the women in your book who represent that strain. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of these rights that you all have won, and I'm going to proclaim against your message, like Phyllis Schlafly, obviously.
So one of the feminists, the face of feminism in my book, is a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, and many of you would be too young to really remember, but if you did, some people feel, in fact, Jill Lepore, who's an eminent historian of American history, says if you can really see the beginning of the sort of far-right push of the Republican Party, it starts with Phyllis Schlafly, and she uses gender as like the new boogeyman. Feminists as the new boogeyman. It's not communists anymore, the Ruskies under the bed, blah, blah. It's these feminists who are out to corrupt our society. But it is always that interesting dynamic. It's kind of the same dynamic where a woman will say, oh, well, the rights we've got up to now were perfectly fine. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly, who famously defeats the Equal Rights Amendment, she says, well, we all know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prevents discrimination on the basis of sex, that's cool. Or the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that Kennedy signed, that's fine. Even Reed versus Reed, which was the first sex discrimination case to be won as late as 1972. So the first time anybody won a sex discrimination was Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1972. And it was over the question of, can women read contracts as well as men? Shouldn't we just presume that men really can read contracts a lot better than women? And that was the law in Idaho. And she's like, I just don't think that reading a contract is something that's related to, your reproductive equipment. So there is that thing that the anti-feminists in every generation, and I look at the revolutionary generation, the women there who had by that time accepted the idea that women should be able to read, but please don't give us more than that. And then the next generation said, well, women should be able to go to school. That's Catherine Beecher, but please don't give us more than that, because that would just be terrible. Women would become men, and men would become women, and the world would fall apart. And each generation has something like that. In fact, Ida Tarbell, who's famously like
that
one
was
of
disappointing.
I'm sorry to bust your
Sorry, go ahead.
bubble about Ida Tarbell, who's like revered in American history because she wrote this big expose of the Stanford Oil Company, the big muckraking journalist, and she wrote a book saying, this vote thing, we just can't do that. No, so here's a woman who went to college, so she got the education part. She speaks in public, she got that part. She lobbies government, she got that part. Get up to chapter 4, and Ida Tarbell, like many anti-feminists, is just not on board. And in fact, she even says, I love this. I was so happy. As an author, you're always happy when you find something that just totally is the cherry on the top of your argument. She goes back to John Adams. And Ida Tarbell says, John Adams had it right when he put down Abigail and said, I cannot but laugh. Because she said, they put too strong a yeast in the Revolution of 1776. Too strong a yeast. And the effects of 1776 are causing trouble even today. So, and then you come up with someone like Phyllis Schlafly, who's even more adamant about these things.
And as I said, we see it today as well, and it's helpful. It's so helpful to have your context and understand that this has been a strain all along, and well, who is it that's the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom work, right?
Yes, I loved Lady Bird Johnson,
yeah.
who says the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom, or something.
Yeah.
She was wonderful. One of the women I interviewed, who actually, there are two people who are still living who are part of the book, because we get right up to the present. And one of them is a woman who wrote a book called The Chicana Feminist in 1975, 76. And the other woman is an indigenous woman who was sentenced to 20 years in prison because a man who was known to be a predator and who had assaulted her son the day before broke into her babysitter's house at 5:30 in the morning, and she was wearing a cast, and she was like 5'2", and he was 6'2". She had a gun because she was worried he was going to come back, and the police had said, "Oh, come in on Monday." She called them on a Friday, and they're like, "Oh no, that's not going to come back on Monday. The office is closed." So he breaks in. He comes at her, and he's so close when he comes to her that the tip of her gun touches his shirt, and then she fires, and she's convicted because there's no defense for battered women. The idea that a woman is at some maybe greater disadvantage than a man in fighting a man is not part of American law. And so those women are just, to this day, they really move my hearts.
Right, and the striking, to me, one of the striking things about your book is that, okay, all these rights eventually hard fought are won, and your last chapter is on, bodily autonomy. It's like that. I mean, that is a thread throughout every single chapter, and that's the last one. I mean, it takes that long to get more progressive rape laws, to get the Me Too movement. You talk about the gymnasts who suffered sexual abuse. I mean, it is shocking how that is a thread throughout the centuries in the book, and that is the last battle in your book that's being fought.
And isn't that funny that the last battle is about the right to life? I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If your government can't defend your very life, then what's it doing? And so yeah, it's an interesting thing. I was just thinking about how do you write this book, and you all know when we got the right to vote or some other thing happened, but this right to physical safety is still, it's bodily autonomy, as you put it very well. We're still not there. In fact, CDC put out statistics like a week ago which show that the rape statistics and sexual abuse of children in particular has not changed since we first started collecting those statistics in the 90s. So the proportionate number of children, and most rapes actually occur under the age of 18. So the time when people are most susceptible to abuse is from 7 to 17. And so I know. Now maybe I'd love to think, and in 50 years, somebody will be sitting here and they'll say, well, and then we got that one licked, But we have to care about it to really want to change it. We don't yet care enough.
So I'd like to open it up to questions. But I would like to say that your book certainly holds out much hope for continuing solutions to either new problems or persistent, long-standing problems.
Yeah,
so
it's a story of progress, basically.
Yes, it is, which confirms your thesis that it was implicit all along and had to be made explicit. So please come up to the microphone and ask a question. And if you can't, for some reason, come up to the microphone, just raise your hand and I'll repeat your question for the mic.
Okay, so hi, Elizabeth. It's great to see you. So my question...
A Signal Corps officer, so dear to my heart. Hello, girls.
We go way back.
Thank you for your
We go way back.
Yeah, we go way back. My question is back to Phyllis Schlafly and how you explain Phyllis Schlafly. Now, I read something, and I can't remember if it was, I can't remember where I got it, but that it goes back to the labor movement and how women got protective laws to protect them before men did, because they were more, I guess the politicians more willing to have labor protections for women, and that women felt that if they had equal rights, they would lose that privilege and be treated sort of like the men used to be treated, I guess. So I just wonder how, do you have a theory or an idea of how women like Phyllis Schlafly, who by all accounts have benefited from the women's movement, then turn into like the anti-feminists?
Well, and that's a good question, and we need to grant her the logic of her arguments. Now, Phyllis Schlafly was in the same camp as Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt also opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, as did Frances Perkins, because they thought that these protective laws for women would, equality means equality, then all these protective statutes have to come down. But kind of one of the interesting things, whenever men got something, it was just considered fair, like the Fair Labor Practices Act. If women got something, it was considered protective. And in fact, the final legal theory that made that stick was that women shouldn't make choices for themselves because we need to preserve their utility as wombs, basically as people who will produce the next generation. So the society had a right to tell women you can't work past 7 p.m. or a society had a right. So that was where these protective laws came from. And then that's just a really interesting philosophical question. And Phyllis Schlafly, it was kind of interesting. The left and the right did kind of which often happens, they did a sideways move. And so the Republican Party endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment before the Democrats. By the time of Phyllis Schlafly, that had flipped around, like on issues of race.
Hi, I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. I think a number of you in the audience may assume that a lot of these sort of equal rights financial issues were long ago solved before our lifetime. And I just want to mention I graduated from law school in 1974, and at that time still a married woman could not establish independent credit. In other words, a married woman could not get a credit card on her own, couldn't take out a loan, et cetera, et cetera. I remember being sort of shocked about that and unaware because my mother, who was divorced and had worked almost all the life that I knew her, was able to do so. But in fact, I was married at the time when I graduated from law school, and it was a rude discovery that I could not, in fact, take out a credit card in my own name. Now, my question is, it must have been difficult to decide which women to discuss in the book and focus on. Can you mention at all some women who came close to being included, but where for various reasons you decided not to cover them? And are there any of those situations you could mention?
Sure. Yeah. There are a lot of choices in the face of feminism. What about Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Why Susan B. Anthony? Susan B. Anthony was the one I thought I was not going to do. Like, so obvious. And then she turned out to be so funny. She was just like so funny and so interesting, and I just, like I'm ready to marry her. She's just so cute. I mean, she's just so funny, and which is such at odds with our picture of her.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, kind of
She seems so austere.
I know, but she was a good cook. She loved children. She was very funny. So I didn't do Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which I think a lot of people would say, well, that's the more obvious pick because she was supposedly the brains behind the operation, which I think is just a disservice to Susan B. Anthony, because Susan B. Anthony was the one who got out there and actually did stuff. I mean, she was the feet and the arms and the hands of women's suffrage, and for decades and decades. Later people, okay, all right. So Beyonce versus Dolly Parton. I know. Beyonce is a better choice.
And why?
Well, that's why. Well,
Why?
I know. And so my editor was like, are you sure you're just not pandering to those young people out there?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, that is such a rude dismissal of Beyonce, who I didn't really know. That's not the music I would listen to. I'm more likely to listen to Beethoven than Beyonce. But, she's just so frank, such a moral leader, I think. It's such a person who's willing to put forward a new moral ethos in her bailiwick. I mean, she's not a political organizer, but she's somebody who's saying, women, you need to stand on your own feet. This is really important. It's really important to pay your own bills. It's important to pay your own ticket to the movie. And by the way, she was just basically quoting Susan B. Anthony there, and also Alexander Hamilton, who said, if you give someone control over my financial destiny, you've given up everything. And so Beyonce has been a purveyor of that notion, her music, since she was a kid, since her first songs, and also body positivity and the idea of equality and marriage and that sort of thing. So anyway, but I did think about Dolly Parton. I did, because I think she's just also kind of funny. And so funny rates is high up there on my list of things that would be, good to know about.
Right.
But I don't think I'm a huge fan of Dolly Parton. But does she make feminism a point the way that Beyonce has?
No, she really doesn't. But she, working women, it's just... Sure. The question is, what is feminism now, right? Is feminism like, I will never shave under my arms? That was the 70s. Is feminism that, I don't know, I won't wear a dress or... And people like Dolly Parton and also Beyonce, even more dramatically, have said, no, feminism is about your right to decide who you are rather than letting someone else define you. I mean, I was so impressed when I discovered what was called her Mrs. Carter tour right after she married to Jay-Z, whose last name is Carter. And she called it Mrs. Carter's tour. And I'm like, that sounds pretty retrograde to me. But then on the backdrop, on the stage, she has the word in giant letters taller than she is, feminist. So what a wonderful statement. I'm going to define myself as Mrs. Carter and a feminist. And don't tell me, you know, I can't be both. You know, I want to choose who I am. And that's what freedom is.
Thank you.
I guess if there's one theme, or one of the many themes that I could take from the book, it would be the lure of progress, the hope of progress, the expansion, and the challenges of that. So I'm wondering if one of the lessons for today's readers who have grown up thinking, hold on, I'm underprivileged because I've only received three credit card offers, and my friend has 5. You know, what I don't know if inspiration or insight would you like them to have taken away from the book?
Well, thank you for that question, because historians we're kind of notorious for picking on, you know, and it wasn't as good as you thought, and this is bad too, and let me tell you about this other thing that was just miserable, and you're like, okay, I'm done, I can't read this anymore. It's like reading the newspaper. But the real story is we start out with a king and we end up with a vice president who's a woman of color. That's the narrative arc. I didn't invent it. So how do we go from this to that? And there's so much to treasure. And I think that if we don't treasure progress, we're more likely to lose it than if we go, no, this is, and that's one reason why I say I want everybody to call themselves a feminist. Go ahead and raise your hands. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that if we say this is our value, Thomas Jefferson said in 1801, it was a big political squabble, and he said it on his inaugural speech, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. What he was saying is we all hold these same values, even if we disagree on other things. I would like the next president to say we're all Federalists, we're not all Republicans necessarily, but we're all feminists. Yeah, I know. Well, that's a different, well, because the word morphed its meaning. But this idea, because otherwise when, you know, Gavin McInnes says, you know, feminists aren't even women and therefore they're punchable, if you don't call yourself a feminist, then you don't know where to go with that. Or Roger Ailes, who infamously, you know, sexually harassed Gretchen Carlson and other women at Fox News. And you know how he got them? You know how he got them to back off? He'd say, well, she's just a feminist. Oh, no, Roger, I'm not a feminist. Yeah, why not? I'm a feminist. I believe in these values that we all hold together. And so progress is about having values in common and defending them.
Thank you so much. That's just wonderful. I told you all you were in for a treat, and it's just a pleasure to listen to you and a pleasure to read your book.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Liza. Thanks for being here. Thank you all.